So recently, Sonos has released the Sonos Beam Gen 2, which is what I'm holding in my hands right now. And a lot of you are asking the question, should we be buying the Sonos ARC or the Sonos Beam Gen 2, which is now capable of playing back Dolby Atmos surround sound as well? So the question is this half the price for about the same thing? Or is the Sonos ARC, which I'm holding here, twice the performance? Let's have that answered today. So I think we have to separate fact from what we call hubris, all right? The fact is that the Sonos Beam Gen 2 at $449 US dollars is half the price of the Sonos ARC at $899 US dollars. And you can't run away from it. It is a hard fact. Now, what is the hubris? The hubris is the Sonos ARC twice the performance. You can say that this has 5 physical drivers. The Sonos Beam Gen 2 is 5 physical drivers, whereas the Sonos ARC has 11 physical discrete drivers, out of which 2 are firing upwards for real true Atmos effects. And this is probably about half the weight and half the length of the Sonos ARC. So the question used to be, well, because one could play Atmos and the Sonos Beam Gen 1 couldn't play Atmos, it was clear. If you wanted an Atmos soundbar with an eARC port that can carry full bandwidth Dolby Atmos signals from your TV with a compatible eARC port, of course, to the Sonos Beam or the Sonos ARC, then you choose the Sonos ARC. But today, with the introduction of the Sonos Beam Gen 2, it is no longer that clear-cut because the major distinction between the two of these has already been taken away, and that is the support for Dolby Atmos. So as with all my videos, I like to give you the short answer up front so you can take the answer and you can run away without finishing the whole video. The short answer is if you choose the Sonos Beam Gen 2 with Dolby Atmos capabilities with an eARC port today, you'll be placing ourselves in a place with a much better value proposition. It is half the price, but the performance is definitely not half that of the Sonos ARC. Now, the performance ratio, right, in hi-fi, in home theater setups, people chase the extra improvement in terms of small percentage points, 1%, 2%, 5% difference with tens of thousands of dollars, right? And in the case of this, it is no exception. So you're spending twice the amount for more than twice the number of drivers, more than twice the weight and twice the length, but you're not going to be getting twice the performance. I can't put a number there, but if you were to force me for a comparison, I would say that the Sonos ARC probably sounds about, I'd say 10% better than the Sonos Beam Gen 2. In terms of processing capabilities, both are the same. They will take a full Dolby Atmos lossless format and they will play it back to you. An even easier guide to helping you make this decision is, I would say, ask your wife what she wants. Most of the viewers on this channel, I would say about 99.5% of you, I'm looking at my YouTube studio stats, and 99.5% of you are males. So I would safely say that for most of you viewers out there, you will probably be conferring with your spouse or your girlfriend on which one you should be spending your money on, right? And invariably, I would say that most of your other half is going to be choosing the Sonos Beam Gen 2 because it is much smaller, much lighter, and it is not bad looking as well. For half the price, almost the same capabilities, it is almost a no-brainer. But if for some reason your heart wins over and you decide that you need to get the Sonos ARC, yes, my voice is straining a little bit because it is significantly heavier and I am having difficulty trying to fit the whole soundbar into the frame. Okay, I can't, right? And if I were to move back a little bit so that I can fit this in the frame, you can see the size difference. Now, a lot of channels and a lot of reviews would have gone through the differences between the two, the size, the weight, the number of drivers, and all that. But this channel is not about talking about all those small little differences, which you can read up, and it's probably much faster for you to read up. I actually do quite extensive testing. I put them in different configurations. I measure the frequency response out from these speakers so that you can visually see for yourself what kind of sound difference you're going to be hearing. Now, and that is what I have actually lined up today for you. There are two things that I'm going to be doing. First is a frequency sweep, which I use a high-powered mic, which is connected to my computer, to measure every frequency from 20 Hz to 20 kilohertz. So there's 19,980 frequencies there. I will smooth them out so that it's easier to read, and you will be able to tell, right, clearly and visually what kind of output the sound bars are actually giving out. And you might be surprised. So if you are interested in that, do stay tuned and watch the rest of the video. For those of you who are very, very interested in this kind of scientific approach to soundbars and audiophile products, do consider subscribing to this channel, ring the notification bell so that you will be notified when a new video launches. So before we go on further to the frequency sweep, a few things I'll clear out of the way so that it will help your decision point in deciding between these two soundbars a little bit easier, is that in choosing between these two, you don't have to worry about the Atmos capabilities anymore, because what used to be in the Sonos Beam Gen 1, they didn't support Dolby Atmos, but now both of these soundbars, the Beam Gen 2 as well as the Sonos ARC, will support Dolby Atmos. So that is out of the picture. You don't have to consider that difference anymore. Of course, this has received a slight price bump of $50, but the Sonos ARC, well, it's the same product as last year, but it's now costing another $100 more. So the price difference between the two is like $450 and $900, literally double the price for not really double the performance. So besides the budget constraint, you have to actually consider that this is a much bigger and longer soundbar. It's going to be heavier as well. If you're going to wall mount, which you can, you have to consider whether your wall or your board is able to support this, the weight of this. This is about 2 Sonos Beam in one unit, and it is almost 4 feet wide. So your TV has got to look, proportionally large enough. I pair this with a 55-inch TV, and it looks kind of flush. 65 is all right, but if you're going to pair this Sonos Beam Gen 2 with a 65-inch or bigger TV, it's probably going to look a little bit out of place. Although I must say that in my living room, I actually pair the Sonos Beam with a 65-inch TV, and it does sound loud and big enough, and the sound is actually pretty spatial. So you probably won't go wrong with the choice of either sound bar. My living room is actually a much larger space. Of course, consider for yourself how big your room is. The bigger the room, the bigger the soundbar you should get to try to fill up the whole room. But if you're going to put in rear surround speakers and sub anyway, so then the Sonos Beam will actually work pretty well. Now, talking about the bass, talking about the subwoofer, I actually observed something very interesting, which I will review in the frequency sweep right away. So let's get into the frequency sweep so that you can get a better understanding of what you are hearing visually. Okay. Now, if you look at this red curve that I'm overlaying on the screen right now, on this end, you have the bass frequencies starting from 20 Hertz, going all the way to 20 kilohertz. Right? So this is the response range. Right about here is about the 100 Hertz mark. So you can see that this particular unit here, this is the Sonos ARC. Okay, this is the frequency response for the Sonos ARC. And for most parts, if you follow the whole curve, it looks relatively flat with a slightly pronounced treble response. This is probably about 10 kilohertz and above. So if you try to break this up, this is the bass, this is the mid-range, which carries the vocal, this is a little bit of the treble, and over here is maybe the environmental cues, which you can't really hear much of. You can sense it, and if something is playing there, you will be able to tell, but it is not something that has a lot of high energy, which you can hear and perceive. Most of what you're going to be hearing is within this range, from about 100 Hertz to about 10 kilohertz or so. And below that is the bass that you feel. Above that is the environmental cues that you feel in the sound mix. So this is the Sonos ARC. And for those of you who have been on my channel, you might be quite familiar with the Sonos ARC sound curve. It's relatively flat. It is pretty powerful already. But what is interesting is that if I were to add a sub into this setup with the Sonos ARC, it actually lifts the entire response higher. So if you look at this portion here, of course, a subwoofer does exactly that, right? Tries to lift the bass response up a little bit. So from about 120 hertz and below, it actually pumps up the bass response of the entire setup quite significantly. But throughout the entire range, in the mid-range, in the treble, and in the high environmental Q response above 10 kilohertz, you actually see that the Sonos ARC is actually outputting a lot more energy throughout the entire range, because the subwoofer has already taken the job, taken the power, all right, requirements away from the Sonos ARC itself, so that the Sonos ARC can allocate more energy, more amplification to the other 11 drivers within the Sonos ARC itself. Now, this is interesting and actually makes the subwoofer a very worthwhile addition to the Sonos ARC. Now, I'm going to remove this sub line, right? So I'm going to leave just the frequency response curve for the Sonos ARC. And I will bring in the Beam Gen 2 frequency response in dark green. This wasn't what I expected. I did not expect the Sonos Beam to actually carry so much more energy in the bass department as well as the vocal department. Now, this range right about here, this intersection point, is about 500 hertz or so. So that is where a lot of the voices are going to be heard, especially the male voices, right? Between 200 to 500 hertz is where you hear a lot of voicing in the content, a lot of dialogue. And Sonos did actually mention that the Sonos Beam Gen 2 is going to sound a lot clearer when it comes to vocal ranges. And this is probably what they were doing. So they boosted this low end below 500 hertz up. And this boost is not trivial. It is a huge, huge boost. If I were to be reading off the chart, this is about 9 to 10 decibel increase, which is tremendous, all right? Now, from this point onwards, this is the 500 hertz, all the way up. It does fall below the Sonos ARC, and you see that this range probably about a 6-7 decibel drop as compared to the Sonos ARC. Now, I did the same thing. I paired one subwoofer, the same sub Gen 3, together with the Sonos Beam Gen 2, and this light green line is what you see. So it actually lifted up the bass response even higher, but for the rest of the curve, actually it made very little difference. So if you are using the Sonos Beam Gen 2 and if you are up to increase a little bit of bass, then what you can do is to add a sub to the mix, and it will bring up the bass response of your whole setup and the whole system quite significantly, except that it doesn't do a lot more in alleviating the power requirements of the Sonos Beam Gen 2 itself, such that it doesn't reallocate a lot of those power to the rest of the 5 drivers when the bass duties are actually being reallocated and reassigned to the Sonos Sub Gen 3. So if you are on a budget, I would say that just get the Sonos Beam Gen 2 and you can kind of end there, right? The sub doesn't do a lot more. Of course, I mean, if you're out for pure bass, then that will be what you get. But the Sonos Beam Gen 2, as you can see from the curves here, from the stock configuration without the subwoofer, it actually gives quite a bit more bass response already. Now, I've got to talk about the quality of the bass response in a little bit, if you could stay on for a couple more minutes. Now, before we go on, let me just pull everything out on the table, right? So dark red and light red. The dark red is the Sonos ARC. The light red is the one Sonos ARC with the sub. The dark green is the Sonos Beam Gen 2, and the light green is Sonos Beam Gen 2 with an addition of a Sonos sub. If you ask me, my take on this is you might actually get away with just spending the money on a Sonos Beam Gen 2. But if you are just out for pure performance, the highest level of fidelity that you can get out of this whole thing and get a very flat frequency response, then you are probably looking at, here you go. You're probably looking at this one. This is the Sonos ARC with the sub. And okay, so there goes the frequency response curves. I do that a lot on my videos. I put all the things that I test through this frequency response sweep where I can, and I will share them with you so that you can visualize what you're actually going to be hearing. Now, the next part and the last part of this test is the sound clips. And I recorded a lot of sound clips as well. I actually use binaural microphone setup, which I put small little tiny mics into my ear canal itself. And I will then record what I'm hearing. So whatever I am hearing, you are actually going to be hearing as well. For this next part, I would suggest that you put on headphones or put on earphones so that you can more closely try to replicate what I'm actually recording. Now, I recorded the clips. Okay, this is a Dolby Atmos full lossless clip that is playing on the Sonos Beam Gen 2 as well as on the Sonos ARC without the subwoofer. So no subwoofer involved. You're just listening to these two soundbar in stock configuration. And I have made some observation. Right? Now, I will split up the observation into three parts. First, the bass. Second, the mid-range. And third, the treble response. Bass for bass. And mid-range for the vocals. And the treble response for more of the environmental cue and the highs so that you can actually have a sensing of the spatial arrangement of the soundtrack that you're going to be hearing. So first up, the bass. I would say this, the Sonos Beam Gen 2 actually sounds very, very loud in the bass department, okay? And earlier I mentioned about the quality of the bass. Now, while it is actually much louder than the Sonos ARC, it doesn't sound as layered. And the bass actually tend to sound a little bit boomier. Now, if you didn't compare the two side by side, you might actually not hear it. You might actually miss the difference because it is not bad. It is just in contrast to the Sonos ARC, it's a little bit more uncontrolled. It's a little bit less tame and it doesn't boom a little bit. Probably because there are less drivers in the first place, and dimensionally the drivers are going to be smaller, and dimensionally the two soundbars actually have very different internal volume, which is important when it comes to recreating bass output. Now, the Sonos ARC at launch did have some bass issues. The bass was causing the drivers to rattle. So over the past 1 year, I do believe, right, at least within the first couple of months of launching the Sonos ARC, the Sonos engineers actually did tune down the bass output of the Sonos ARC quite a bit, right, so that it doesn't push the drivers beyond its excursion limits. So with that in mind, I would think that the response of the Sonos ARC, the bass response at least, would have been a little bit more tempered down and would have been a little bit more rein-in. So the Sonos engineers weren't trying to, weren't trying to push the Sonos ARC as hard in the bass department, whereas the Sonos Beam didn't have that problem. And when it came to the bass, they could probably go a little bit wilder there. So the Sonos Beam Gen 2 definitely has a little bit higher bass output for your room, whereas the Sonos ARC has a slightly more subtle bass output. You probably are going to need the Sonos sub together with the Sonos ARC, if you ask me. So next up, we're going to be talking about the voicing, the vocals, right? And this has got to do with the mid-range. So if you observe the earlier curve, I also said that the mid-range of the Sonos Beam is actually a lot more pronounced than the Sonos ARC itself. And this is the Sonos Beam Gen 2, which the company has said that they actually retune the things a little bit so to make voices more understandable, more intelligible, and you are able to hear voices a lot clearer in your soundtrack. So if you listen to the next part of the clip here, you will hear that on the Sonos Beam Gen 2, the voicing, the vocal, is going to be really right up front, and it's very centered, and it is much louder with the emphasis clearly on the voice. And if you listen to the vocal recordings coming from the Sonos ARC, same portion of the clip, you'll hear that it is a little bit more dispersed. It's a little bit wider. The voice seems to be coming from a slightly more faced out angle. So you don't hear the voice narrowly focused right in front.
This is Dolby Atmos, the world's first object-based cinematic audio. With this is Dolby Atmos, the world's first object-based cinematic audio.
Which brings us to the next point on the treble. So the treble, the environmental cues that you're going to be hearing, that's got to do with the higher frequency ranges, right? Maybe above 2 kilohertz, above 3 kilohertz, all the way up to 10 kilohertz and even 20 kilohertz for those of you who claim that you can hear up to 20 kilohertz. So on the Sonos Beam Gen 2, the treble is actually very spatial. It is kind of quite spread out. Now, it doesn't have side-mounted drivers, unlike the Sonos ARC, which, this is getting I don't think I can handle two soundbars together, but let me try. The Sonos ARC has side-firing drivers here, which will fire off sounds to the side. And that actually gives a pretty wide soundstage. But on the Sonos Beam, you will be surprised, right? There are times, even after years of owning the Sonos Beam Gen 1, I hear things that are coming out from the side and say, hey, that shouldn't be. This is a 2 feet wide soundbar. And when it comes to the Sonos Beam Gen 2, you will actually hear a much, much more immersive soundstage. I don't know what kind of magic they did with this 2 feet soundbar, but trust me, if you're comparing this soundbar to any other longer format soundbars in the market, you will be surprised at what this 2 feet wonder can do. So on the Sonos ARC, the environmental cues, the treble, is actually more narrowly focused, as opposed to the voice, right? The vocals on the Sonos ARC were more widely dispersed, but the treble and the environmental cues, they are more narrowly focused. But the surround sound, the rear surround, is actually more convincing. I would say that this is due in part to the side-firing drivers, which are not actually present on the Sonos Beam Gen 2. We have explained the three parts: the bass, the mid-range, and the treble. There's one more thing that I find that we need to talk about, which is the upward firing speakers for Atmos. On the Sonos Beam Gen 2, there is no upward firing channels, no upward firing drivers. On the Sonos ARC, you actually get two drivers, which of course you can't really see. I don't know whether the light can catch it, but you can't see, but there are two drivers right here, which will fire upwards. Now, without the presence of that driver, this is going to have to work harder computationally and to calculate the sound, to simulate the Atmos surround sound. And in this particular setup here, there's a 5-phase array, which I don't know how it actually works, but it does work pretty well. You will hear that, the sounds are coming. But one thing that I have clarified with Sonos directly is that there is a setting in the software that as of today, as of now, you can adjust the height volume on the Sonos ARC, but there is no way you can adjust the volume on the Sonos Beam Gen 2 for the height channel. So you can select, if you have surround sound, you can select how loud you want the surround channels to be. If you have a subwoofer, you can select how loud you want it to be for the sub, but you cannot select how loud you want the height channel to be for the Sonos Beam Gen 2, as opposed to the Sonos ARC, which today you actually can do that. Now, to end off this video, there is one point that I have to make, and I have been thinking about that feature, I've been asking about the feature, I've been seeding ideas to the guys at Sonos, which is to allow a discrete speaker to be used as Atmos. Now, imagine if I have two spare Sonos, one IKEA Symphonics, one SL, Sonos 5, right? Even, or the Sonos Play 3. And I want to allocate them mounted to the ceiling or somewhere above me to fire downwards to play the Atmos content. I should be able to add these two, like how I'm adding surround channels to my Sonos ARC. Now, if they implement that feature, okay, it's going to make it really, really hard to actually recommend the Sonos ARC anymore, because the Sonos ARC, the main difference, because both can play Atmos now, the main difference will be the upward firing speaker, which is not present on the Sonos Beam Gen 2. But if you allow that feature to pull in 2 extra speakers to act as the real, actual, discrete speakers for Atmos, for high channel, then the Sonos Beam Gen 2 is going to be one hell of a speaker, of a soundbar to buy, because you could put the money towards 2 discrete one SL, for example, or even the IKEA Symphonics bookshelf to be used as Atmos, and you won't be missing the top firing speakers for the Sonos ARC anymore. Okay, so to end today's video, which I think is going to be a little bit long, I will leave you with the full clip recording, binaural recording from the Sonos Beam Gen 2 playing a full lossless Atmos clip versus the Sonos ARC playing the same full lossless Dolby Atmos clip. I will see you in my next video.
This is Dolby Atmos, the world's first object-based cinematic audio. With powerful moving audio that transcends from channels to moving around you with pinpoint accuracy. Whether the soundscape sets the mood of a scene, or captures the full extent of nature's fury. This is Dolby Atmos, the world's first object-based cinematic audio. With powerful moving audio that transcends from channels to moving around you with pinpoint accuracy. Whether the soundscape sets the mood of a scene, or captures the full extent of nature's fury.